This is Harsh Rules. I'm Ben Harsh, and today we're going to learn to play Axis and Allies World War I, 1914. Axis and Allies World War I, 1914 was published in 2013 by Avalon Hill and designed by Larry Harris Jr. This game supports up to 8 players and takes 8+ hours to play. Axis and Allies is known as the World War II area control game, but this game takes those mechanics and places them in World War I. However, don't approach this game thinking this is just Axis and Allies with a World War I paint job. While there are many familiar mechanics retrofit into this game from the World War II version, there are also several new rules that may surprise veterans of the classic game. In the early 20th century, World War I introduced air, submarine, and mechanized warfare on a global stage. Many of these new technologies are just being field tested and are not as refined as their World War II counterparts, so they may play differently in this game. Also, for a fair chunk of this game, America is not actively involved. They exist as a neutral power that under the right conditions can enter the war. Overall, it's important to remember that World War I is a very European conflict. You'll notice several European powers are available to players that would not reappear in the same fashion in World War II. Also, the game map is very different and provides a great number of new strategic and logistical challenges. So, if all of this sounds interesting to you, stick around, because we're going to learn to play Axis and Allies World War I, 1914. Let's begin by learning how to set up the game and how the various components function. This is the game board for Axis and Allies World War I, 1914. This board is designed to be a spherical look at the globe with a focus on Europe. Now I'm going to enhance the board with some garish colors to make it easier to learn the layout. In this World War I game, the conflict is divided into 2 sides. On the Axis side, actually the Central Powers at this time period, are Germany, the Ottoman Empire, and Austria-Hungary. On the Allied side of the conflict is the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Russia, and, eventually, the United States. Each nation has a capital that can deploy land and air units. The United Kingdom has a separate sub-capital in Bombay, India. This represents the vast British Empire's colonies across the globe and allows the British Empire to source military resources from the East. Each nation's navy is constructed and launched from harbors in their territories. Axis and Allies World War I, 1914 follows the classic area control gameplay mechanic of its predecessors. Nations belonging to the Central and Allied powers fight each other to expand their side's overall control of the board. They do this by battling and taking control of each other's territories. Most territories contain an industrial production value represented by a circled number in the space. When a nation conquers one of their opponent's territories, they gain this numbered amount in industrial power. Likewise, the defeated opponent loses this amount in industrial power. At the end of a player's turn, they receive Industrial Production Certificates, or IPCs, the game's currency, equal to their cumulative industrial power. This currency is used to purchase more military units to defend existing territories and conquer enemy territories to gain more industrial power. It's this military interaction between the players that forms the core of gameplay. The cumulative total of each nation's production is tracked on the National Production Chart. This chart can be found on the game board in the Sahara Desert territory. This chart tracks each nation's total production on 2 lines. The top line is the 10th space. The line below this is the 1 space. For example, the starting production value for Germany is 35. Therefore, the Germany player places one control marker on the 30 position on the top line, and a second marker is placed on the 5 position on the second line. When the other players add their control markers to the two lines, the space looks like this. As territorial control is jockeyed between players, these positions will be updated to keep score. This bookkeeping is critical because it determines the amount of IPC currency awarded at the end of each player's turn. Now, as far as currency goes, you might have noticed this game doesn't have any. The instruction manual recommends you get paper and a pencil and you keep track of everybody's money. So your first option is to become an accountant and create a ledger. In my opinion, this isn't an acceptable solution. Your second option is to find an old copy of Axis and Allies and make that ultimate sacrifice. Take the currency out of that game, use it for this game. Your third option is to find an old copy of Monopoly and make it support the war effort. Finally, option 4 is to head over to Historical Board Gaming. This site sells all kinds of components for your Axis and Allies games, and specifically, they have World War I themed battle bucks. These battle bucks cost about $10 of real-world money, plus shipping. So if each player throws in a couple dollars, you can use these and not be bothered with the pencil and paper record keeping. Now we're back at the game board. Before you fill up your board with figures, let's talk territories. The only territories players cannot enter, I've color-coded magenta. That would be the Sahara Desert Territory in Africa, and the Himalayas in the upper right-hand corner of the board. The game's remaining territories fall under a unique classification system. Let's take a closer look. There are 8 playable national powers in this game, divided into 2 groups. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire on the Central Powers side, and the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and Italy on the Allied Powers side. The United States is classified in the center as a neutral power. However, all 8 of these national powers are considered major powers. This game also has minor powers, which are non-playable nations that have an affiliation with one of the major powers. This affiliation is identified by a smaller flag emblem accompanying the minor power emblem. For example, on the Central Powers side, the minor power of Bulgaria has an affiliation with the Ottoman Empire. Minor powers possess small standing armies that can be mobilized to support their affiliated nation or oppose that nation's enemy. These armies are mobilized when a major power's forces enter the minor power's territory. Using Bulgaria as an example, if Allied forces enter the territory, that nation mobilizes its standing army to defend itself. If Central Powers enter Bulgaria, then they mobilize their forces to join them. As you can see from the emblems, Bulgaria has an affiliation with the Ottoman Empire. Therefore, when raising Bulgaria's army, you use Ottoman Empire units. When mobilizing a nation, take their industrial production number and double it to determine the number of units to place. The first unit placed is always an artillery piece, and the remaining units are infantry. So when Bulgaria raises its standing army, they get 1 artillery piece and 5 infantry units. Finally, a note on the minor powers of Belgium and Portugal. These minor powers also have African colonies. When a major power enters one of these colonies, they cannot raise a standing army. The colonies are too sparsely populated. You can tell a territory is a colony because it does not have a major power symbol next to it. Finally, there are neutral powers. These nations have made it very clear they want to stay out of the war. However, Unlike neutral territories in other Axis and Allies games, these nations will mobilize an army in self-defense to repel invaders from either side. When raising a neutral power's standing army, use a unit on the opposite side of the nation that invaded. For example, if Germany invades Holland, the Allied powers would elect a nation to represent Holland. That nation would receive Holland's 2 industrial points, use their figures to raise Holland's standing army, and control them for the remainder of the game. Therefore, be very careful when deciding whether or not to invade a neutral power, and be aware of the alliances with minor powers and what the existing affiliations with major powers are. Now that we have a better understanding of the map and the various territories, let's look at setting up the game board. Each player will receive a supply box with their nation's units inside. The lid on the supply box is your guide to setting up your nation. It will list all the territories and the units you need to place there. Inside the box, you'll find that Axis and Allies World War I 1914 has early variations of all the classic unit types. For fans of miniatures, the infantry are all uniquely sculpted to each nation, but the remainder of these units are just color variations on the same sculpt. However, the biggest challenge players will face is that there just aren't very many of these figures for each nation. Depending on an individual player's strategy, it can be difficult to find enough miniatures to distribute on the board. I had read an article that Avalon Hill/Hasbro would supply extra units to game owners, but I think that program has probably been abandoned by now. Once again, if you find your game group is running out, you'll need to either find substitutes, maybe get out your regular copy of Axis and Allies and use the figures from that, purchase a second copy of this game, or buy some World War I figures from historical board gaming. That said, to maximize the use of the figures you did get with the game, you need to use chips. With 8 players and similar colors on the board, things can become crowded and confusing pretty quickly. Therefore, players must use chips to organize their units and visually communicate their side's progress on the board. The central powers use the red chips and the allied powers use the blue chips. The figure placed on top identifies the units represented by the stack and counts as 1 unit. The darker colored chips represent 5 units, and the lighter colored chips represent 1 unit. This game does not come with very many figures. Therefore, using chips in this game is a must. After each player has set up their starting units, let's talk about what's needed to win the game. For a Central Powers victory, Paris or London must be captured, as well as at least one other Allied capital that is then held through the end of the US player's turn. For an Allied Powers victory, Berlin must be captured, as well as either Constantinople or Vienna, and these must be held through the end of the Ottoman Empire player's turn. Now at this point, you should be able to set up the game, and we're ready to start learning how to play. Next, let's take a look at the phases of gameplay. Axis and Allies World War I 1914 follows a set order of play for every game round. The first player in a game round is Austria-Hungary, followed by Russia, then Germany, France, the United Kingdom, the Ottoman Empire, Italy, and finally the United States. Each player's turn is divided into 5 phases. In the first phase, the player will purchase new units and repair any damaged units. Newly purchased units are placed in the mobilization zone and will not be available until Phase 4. In the next phase, the player moves their units into enemy territories or moves units to reinforce their positions. For Phase 3, all conflicts are resolved and any territories that are lost or gained are updated on the national production chart. For Phase 4, new units are removed from the mobilization zone. Land and air units are placed at the nation's capital. Naval units are placed in the nation's harbors. Then these units may be moved. Finally, in Phase 5, players check the national production chart and collect the appropriate amount of IPCs based on the territories they now control. This ends the current player's turn, and the next player will then run through the same 5 phases, and so on. Now, let's look at each of these phases in greater detail. Let's look at Phase 1, Purchase and Repair Units. In this phase, the player can spend IPCs to purchase additional units. There are 8 units to choose from, 3 land units, 1 air unit, and 4 naval units. Costs per unit range from 3 IPCs for each infantry to 12 IPCs for each battleship. When purchasing units, there is one rule to keep track of. Tanks cannot be purchased until the 4th round of play. After each player has selected and paid for their units with IPCs, the units are placed in the mobilization zone. The mobilization zone is located in the Sahara Desert territory in the lower half of the map. These new units will remain there until Phase 4, Move New Units. Finally, a player may repair damaged units. Specifically, this refers to the battleship, which can sustain 2 hits. When a battleship suffers 1 hit, a player turns the figure on its side to keep track of the damage. During this phase, the player can repair the damaged battleship back to full strength at no cost. However, the battleship must be within a sea zone that contains a naval base that player owns. I've highlighted all the naval bases on this map to show you where they are located. Next up is Phase 2, Movement. In this version of Axis and Allies, the range of units is greatly simplified. All land units can move 1 space. Fighters and most naval vessels can move 2 spaces. Only the naval cruiser can move 3 spaces. Territory movement is handled differently in this game than any other traditional Axis and Allies game. Territories are classified into 3 types. Friendly territories contain units from a player's own forces or a friendly power. In our example here, a German infantry unit is in its own friendly Prussia territory. Hostile territories only contain enemy units. In our example, you can see Russia's Poland territory only has a Russian infantry unit. The 3rd territory classification is where things get interesting. A force invading a hostile territory requires at least 1 infantry unit. Once the invading force enters the hostile territory, it becomes known as contested. Contested territories have their own set of rules. They generate no IPC income. So when a territory becomes contested, the player needs to adjust the national production chart. So in this example, Russia was at 25, and when Poland became contested, it lowers that nation's overall production by 3 to 22. For a territory to remain contested, the invading forces must always have at least 1 infantry unit present. To remove this status, the defender must eliminate all invading units or the invader must withdraw them. When all invaders are removed, Russia's production level increases by 3 again. If the invaders defeat the Russian units there and conquer the territory, Germany's production increases by 3. Finally, let's talk about air unit movement. There is only 1 air unit in this game, fighters. A fighter must begin its movement in a friendly territory. From there, they can move into any type of territory. However, with their last movement point, they must be able to land in a territory controlled by their own power. Now, let's talk about naval unit movement. The various oceans shown on the game board are divided into sea zones. Unlike territories, sea zones are identified by numbers. In this example, I'm showing 3 sea zones numbered 1 to 3. Most naval units can move 2 sea zone spaces per turn. Cruisers can move 3 sea zone spaces per turn. Sea zones themselves can be classified as either friendly or hostile to the active player. Each unit has specific rules in how they interact with sea zones, whether they're hostile or friendly. Transports cannot enter hostile sea zones without an escort from a warship from the same power. Whenever the active player moves surface ships, battleships, cruisers, and escorted transports into a hostile sea zone with either battleships or cruisers, they must stop in that sea zone. If only submarines and transports occupy a hostile sea zone, those same forces may pass through to the next sea zone. Submarine units are capable of submersion and moving undetected through sea zones. This also allows them to pass through a hostile sea zone without stopping. This game also has a new sea zone weapon called minefields. All sea zones that contain a naval base are considered to be mined. Mines are active when the territory adjacent to the naval base is either under the control of enemy units or contested. At the end of this phase, the owner rolls a die for each ship in the mined sea zone or ships that pass through the sea zone. On a roll of 1, that ship struck a mine and is destroyed. Therefore, be very cognizant when traveling through a sea zone with an enemy naval base. While we're talking about movement and sea units, let's cover off on the transport. Transports cannot conduct combat and are primarily used to transport land and air units. Yes, in this version of Axis and Allies, they can transport air units. A transport has cargo room for 2 of either land or air units. While units are on board, they are considered cargo and cannot participate in combat. Some additional rules for transports. A transport cannot enter hostile waters unless it has at least 1 armed naval escort. Also, a transport can only load or offload cargo from a friendly sea zone. And once a transport offloads, they end their movement in that sea zone. Transports can be used cooperatively amongst alliance to transport their units. Transports can also participate in coordinated naval landings called Amphibious Assaults. We'll cover off on Amphibious Assaults in the combat phase. Now it's time for Phase 3, Combat. In combat, each unit has skills as either an attacker or a defender. When a 6-sided die is rolled, a hit is scored if that unit rolls their attack or defend rating or less. Some units may perform better as defenders rather than attackers, and vice versa. Some units, like the transport, have no attack or defense rating at all. In this chart, each unit is represented with the attack rating on the left in red and the defense rating on the right in black. As you can see, a roll of 5 or a 6 for either rating is considered a miss. Once again, combat in this game is handled differently than other versions of Axis and Allies. In this version of the game, the figures are not removed from the game board. Instead, small dice are placed to represent the unit on the battle board. To set up the battle board, each side references the game board for the types of figures involved in the conflict and places 1 dice for each unit in the appropriate section. First, let's review the attacker's side of the battle board. Air units are placed in the dividing line between the attacker and the defender. This section is used for air supremacy, which we'll talk about in just a few moments. A die is then placed for each tank, each infantry, and each battleship involved in an amphibious assault. The spaces for these die are on the left side of the battle board. At the bottom of the battle board, place a die for each artillery piece involved in the battle. Now, you might have noticed small red arrows printed on the battle board itself. These arrows indicate opportunities for unit promotions via combined arms operations. The attacker has 3 opportunities for these unit promotions. First, on the attacker's right side of the battle board is a promotional opportunity for a tank. A tank can be promoted to an attack value of 3 if combined with an artillery piece. An infantry unit can be promoted to an attack value of 3 when combined with an artillery piece as well. Finally, all artillery units can be promoted to an attack value of 4 if the attacker gains air supremacy. A quick note, a tank or an infantry unit cannot be paired to the same artillery unit. If there is only one artillery unit to go around, the player must choose which unit is joined to which unit in combined arms. Next, we're going to flip the battle board over and take a look at the defender's side. The defender also uses the dividing line on the battle board to place a die for each of their air units involved in the battle. The defender's regular unit spaces are located along the bottom row. The defender will place a die in the appropriate space for each artillery piece, each tank, and each infantry. The defender also has 1 promotional opportunity space. If the defender wins air supremacy, then all their artillery units are promoted from a defense value of 3 to 4. Now, let's talk about the actual steps in the combat sequence. In Axis and Allies World War I 1914, land combat is conducted in 1 round. If after this round of combat, units from both sides survive, the territory remains contested. The next round of combat for the contested territory will occur on the next player involved in the conflict's turn. Land combat itself is divided into 6 steps. First, as we saw in the earlier examples, the battle board is populated with mini dice rather than the miniatures themselves for each unit involved in the conflict. In this example, the attacker brings to the conflict 1 fighter, 1 tank, 1 infantry unit, and 1 artillery unit. With this battle lineup, the attacker has 2 promotion opportunities. The attacker can pair his tank with his artillery or his infantry with his artillery. Both promotional opportunities add the same upgrade in attack value. Therefore, the attacker chooses to promote his tank. On the other side of the battle, the defender has 1 fighter, 1 tank, 1 infantry unit, and 1 artillery piece. Next, players will determine air supremacy. Essentially, this is a pre-battle that takes place in the skies above the main conflict until one side's fighters remain. To determine air supremacy, each side rolls a die for each of their fighters. A roll of 1 or a 2 is a hit and removes an enemy unit. This continues until one side's fighters are eliminated. Once the skies are cleared of one side's fighters, air supremacy is complete. Also, as a bonus, the winner's surviving fighters get to participate in the subsequent battle. Now, let's determine air supremacy in our example. Each side has a fighter in the air, and they each roll 1 die. The attacker rolls a 3, and the defender rolls a 1. Therefore, the attacking fighter is destroyed, and the defender gains air supremacy. Also, because the defender gained air supremacy, that player's artillery units get promoted. And all artillery pieces now have a defense value of 4. In the next phase, attacking units get to fire. The attacker then tries to roll the attack value or less of each of his units represented by dice on the battle board. Roll the dice for each section 1 at a time. When a hit is scored, place each die along the defender's side of the battle board. So now let's run through this with our example. First, the promoted tank rolls a die, and rolls a 6, which is a miss. Next, the attacker rolls the die for the infantry unit and rolls a 5, which is also a miss. Finally, the attacker rolls a die for the artillery unit and rolls a 3, which is a hit. The artillery die with the hit is placed on the defender's side of the battle board. This way they can keep track of all their casualties. Next, the defending units get to fire. This time the defender tries to roll their defense value or less for each unit. Place the die with a hit result on the attacker's side of the battle board. However, keep in mind there is a special rule if the attacker has tanks involved in the battle. A special advantage of attacking tanks is that they can absorb one enemy die hit per tank. So when the defender's die rolls are complete, remove one hit die for each tank on the attacker's side. Now let's walk through our example for the defenders. First, the defender rolls for his fighter and rolls a 3, which is a miss. Next, the defender rolls one die for his tank and rolls a 6, which is a miss. The defender then rolls a die for his infantry unit and rolls a 5, which is a miss. Finally, the defender rolls for his promoted artillery piece and rolls a 4, which is a hit. The defender then slides the artillery unit die to the attacker's side of the board. Next, it's time to remove casualties. Each side removes their own casualties. However, keep in mind, the last unit of an attacking or defending force to be removed must be an infantry unit. Therefore, it may be necessary to remove other more powerful units first to keep that last infantry unit on the battle board. In our example, the attacker is going to use his tank's special ability to absorb the one casualty. The defender is going to select his tank as the casualty. Remember, the defender's tank does not have the absorption ability. Finally, the last phase is to conclude combat. At this point, if both sides still have units remaining in the battle, the territory remains contested. If one side is eliminated, the winner takes control or retains control. Also, remember to adjust the industrial production chart for the added industrial points. If a fluke event occurs and both sides are totally eliminated, the territory reverts back to the original owner. And that is how land combat works. In our example, both sides still have units on the field, so the battle will continue in another turn. Next, let's talk about naval combat. I'm starting to sound like a broken record here, but this game does not include a battle board for naval conflicts. If you haven't noticed, this game has some component issues. Fortunately, naval combat is fairly simple and mimics the traditional combat from other Axis and Allies games. Unlike territory combat, where only one round is played at a time, naval combat continues until one side is eliminated. Also, attacker and defender combat values are the same. Therefore, a player needs to roll a 2 or less for a submarine, a 3 or less for a cruiser, or a 4 or less for a battleship. I've created this simple battle board to help you visualize how the rules work. There are files over on BoardGameGeek that you can download to create your own battle board. From this point, you can track the combat with mini die like you do with the other battle board. Or you can take the miniatures off the main game board and line them up and work that way. I'll just place a mini die in each section to give you the general idea. Naval combat is conducted in multiple rounds over the following 4 steps. In step 1, attacking units fire. First, let's start with submarines. Subs can choose to fire and roll a die to attack, or the player can declare that their submarine is going to submerge. If a submarine submerges, it is essentially disengaging from the battle. However, the submarine may be removed as a casualty until the end of the turn. After that, remove the submarine from the battle completely. If a player decides to submerge a submarine, flip the submarine miniature on its side to indicate it is withdrawing from the battle. In this example, we'll go ahead and roll the dice for the submarine. Next, roll an attack die for each cruiser and then each battleship. All hits are recorded and saved for the remove casualties phase. In Phase 2, the defending units fire. Just like in the attacking phase, roll a die for each unit. Then tally and record the hits for the next phase. Now in Phase 3, each side removes their own casualties from their forces. Remember, battleships can take 2 hits before destroyed, and transports in the battle can only be removed as casualties once all other units have been removed. Also, any submarines that have submerged can still be selected as a casualty. If submarines are the only units that remain and they're submerged, they still must be chosen as a casualty. In our example here, each side is going to use their battleship to absorb their 1 casualty. Remember to flip the battleship on its side to keep track of this. In the final phase, the attacker has the option to break off the attack or press the attack for another round of combat. Breaking off the attack ends combat and all surviving units remain in the sea zone. Combat can be reinitiated between these units in the next available turn, whether this is the attacker's next turn or the defender's next turn. If the attacker decides to press the attack, then another round of combat is initiated. This cycle will continue until either the attacker breaks off the attack or one side's units are completely eliminated. Now, let's talk about amphibious actions. Amphibious actions are divided into 2 types. An amphibious assault takes place when a player's fleet lands forces in a hostile coastal territory from an adjacent sea zone. An amphibious reinforcement takes place when a player's fleet lands forces in a contested or friendly coastal territory from an adjacent sea zone. A key factor that complicates the process is whether the adjacent sea zone is defended. If the answer is no, the player can proceed to unload cargo units from their transports onto the shore. If the answer is yes, a naval battle must first be fully resolved before the actual landing can begin. If the hostile sea zone only contains transports and submarines, the landing force can choose to bypass them and head directly to the shore to offload units. However, if a hostile sea zone contains at least 1 cruiser or battleship, a sea battle must be fought first. When declaring an amphibious assault or reinforcement in Phase 2 movement, the intent is that if the landing force survives the naval battle in Phase 3 combat, the cargo units will then be moved ashore. The offloaded units can then participate in combat during the current round. Therefore, the 2 battles must be coordinated appropriately. First the sea battle, and then the associated land battle. Alright, let's run through an illustration of the amphibious assault to paint a clearer picture of how it works. The amphibious assault is broken up into 3 parts. First, any sea battles are resolved, then the bombardment phase, and finally the land battle. Let's walk through them one at a time. First, our naval assault force proceeds into the hostile sea zone. If there are only submarines and transports inhabiting the hostile zone, the assault force can choose to attack them and perform a sea battle, or ignore them and proceed to the shoreline. However, if at least 1 battleship or cruiser is present, the assault force must stop and clear at least the battleships and cruisers from the sea zone before proceeding ashore. Another important note, if a sea battle occurs, the battleships and the assault force will not be able to use their offshore bombardment ability in the next phase. A battleship can only participate in 1 battle per turn. Once any sea battles are resolved, the next phase is bombardment. The key activity during this phase is that units are offloaded from transports. In this phase, any battleships in the assault force may each fire one shot at enemy units in the adjacent territory. On a roll of 4 or less, they score a hit, and the defender must remove a unit from their forces. Next, each defending artillery unit may take a preemptive shot against the units offloading from the transports. On a roll of 3 or less, a hit is scored and the attacker removes one unit from his offloaded units. A special note, tanks are just being brought ashore and cannot absorb hits like in traditional land combat. Once this is done, surviving units are considered to have successfully landed and the land battle commences. Offloaded units may link up with existing friendly forces in a contested territory, or engage the enemy and convert a hostile territory into a contested territory. Land battles are then resolved per the usual rules. While we're talking about combat, let's discuss territory capture and capital liberation. When a major power captures an enemy territory, they place their control marker to mark the territory as under their control. That conquering nation also benefits from that territory's IPCs. However, if a major power's capital is captured by an invader, such as often happens with France, that nation also collects all that player's unspent IPCs. This is known as a treasury raid. In our example, let's say the German player invades and captures Paris. The German player places his or her control marker on Paris and adds 6 industrial points to the industrial production chart. The French player loses 6 industrial points but is still in the game. They just cannot collect income or purchase new units without their capital. The French player's surviving forces fight on from territories they still inhabit. This means that the French player would skip all game phases in their turn except movement and conduct combat. Don't worry, all hope is not lost for a player's captured territories and capitals. If an alliance member of that player recaptures a territory of their teammate, they liberate that territory. The original owner of that territory regains control and the associated industrial points immediately. In the case of a capital, that player is also able to purchase and place new units and collect income again. However, the invader who lost the liberated capital does not pay back any IPCs from their treasury raid. Therefore, be very wary of stockpiling money when the enemy is on your doorstep. Next up is Phase 4, New Unit Movement. In this phase, players remove their new units from the mobilization zone and move them into position. Land and air units are placed in the territory space containing that nation's capital. As a note, Great Britain has the option of placing land and air units in London, England, or in Bombay, India. Be aware that if the player does not have at least one infantry unit in their capital space, that player must exchange either one new fighter or land unit with an infantry unit as a penalty. New sea units are launched from the nation's naval bases. Naval bases are indicated on the game board with an anchor symbol. I've marked all naval bases on this visual with blue dots. In this version of Axis and Allies, new units can interplay even in a contested territory or a hostile sea zone, hence the penalty I just mentioned. No combat occurs when these units are placed because the combat phase is over. And finally, we have Phase 5, Collect Income. In this phase, players will review the national production chart and collect the amount of IPCs equal to their number on the graph. However, to collect IPCs, the player's capital must be under their control and not under an enemy power's control. During this game phase, the German player may also conduct unrestricted submarine warfare on Great Britain and the United States. This feature we will cover off next in the nation-specific rules. Now let's talk about special rules for America and Russia. First, let's talk about the rules regarding American isolationism. At the beginning, America's stance on this war was that they were a neutral major power with Allied sympathies. In the first few phases of the game, America operates under certain restrictions. They may not move their land or air units into territories controlled by the Central Powers or neutral territories. And they may not attack Central Power sea units. America's isolationism can end in several ways. If Germany attacks American units, if America loses income from unrestricted submarine warfare, or if the game reaches round 4, isolationism is over. Let's talk about Germany's use of unrestricted submarine warfare. To enable this feature, Germany must declare it, and this is how it works. These attacks occur during the collect income phase of the British Empire and the American player. Germany will roll a die for each submarine in sea zones 2, 7, and 8. Each die result of a 1 or a 2 reduces that attack power's collected income by 1 IPC. If the United States suffers a hit, neutrality ends and they enter the war. Russia is another major power that has special rules in this game. The rules for the Russian Revolution are optional. Therefore, before beginning a game, decide with your game group whether or not the Russian Revolution rules will be used. These rules are best implemented with less than 8 players. It is recommended that a player takes the role of the United States and Russia to use these rules. The Russian Revolution will occur in round 4 if Russia is losing the war. The following factors must be in play to trigger the revolution. 3 or more territories adjacent to Moscow are under the Central Powers' control. Plus, 1 other Russian territory falls under Central Power control or is contested. Finally, the revolution itself can be triggered if Moscow falls under Central Powers control. When this occurs, an armistice is signed with the Central Powers, and Russia leaves the game. Following the revolution, all units outside original Russian territories are removed from the game board. Russia then forfeits all future turns. The Central Powers can no longer conduct combat with Russian forces or move into Russian territories. However, contested territories remain open to Central Powers movement as long as 1 infantry is present in each territory. The Central Powers also retain control and collect income from Russian territories under their power, but must maintain 1 infantry unit in each. These rules add an interesting dynamic to the game and can greatly help the Central Powers win. Keep the Russian Revolution rules in mind when organizing your own game. And now you and your friends should know enough to get your own game started of Axis and Allies World War I, 1914. While this game inexplicably has some annoying component issues, the rules themselves are top-notch. This game is a great new addition to the Axis and Allies game family, and I recommend everybody give it a shot. Questions about this game, requests for future Harsh Rules game tutorials, and constructive feedback are all greatly appreciated. Drop a line in the comments section. To be the first notified when this episode and any Harsh Rules episode is placed online, please subscribe to this channel. Until then, I'm Ben Harsh for Harsh Rules. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next episode.